Hey, welcome to the Birdcraft Technology. I am your host, Joshua. Today we're going to be continuing on reviewing the book Manifesto by Mike Busch, an AMPIA who has given a lot to aviation. I mean, I keep saying that he's definitely set the example of what it looks like to serve from an aviation maintenance perspective in aviation. I wanted to talk about the pilot shortage. You know, I hear it. There's rumors of there being a pilot shortage, and you see, the magazines. I see a lot of different articles. But when I talk to the more experienced pilots out there, I mean, haven't we all heard about the pilot shortage? Haven't we all heard about like the aviation maintenance shortage? I don't know about you guys, but I'm constantly hearing it. I don't understand how you cannot hear it. It's everywhere. And so I've talked to more experienced pilots and mechanics, and the more experienced pilots are like, yeah, we don't believe it. We don't believe it because back in the day when there was I guess this is like in the 70s and 80s, when there was a pilot shortage, they said they saw a lot more evidence of the fact that these companies cared about producing skilled and experienced pilots and qualified pilots and things that they would do. They said there was airlines that would take you from zero to hero, would literally take you from maybe just a private pilot or a commercial pilot, and would train you and give you your ATP, right? They would pay you to go to school, or they would hire you on, send you through the training, and then make you a qualified pilot, and then get you in flying. We're not seeing that these days. I've seen some programs that take maybe a commercial helicopter pilot, and then they get you they provide the route for you to get your fixed wing route. There's a couple of those things out there. I had to look behind me. I had one written on the board from talking to a pilot earlier, but I mean, we've all heard it. Everyone has different opinions. We wonder if it's true, if there really is that shortage. We know that the cockpit's becoming more automated, and we wonder if we're even going to need skilled pilots in the future. They're talking about, making the pilot more like a human monitoring system, just sitting in the cockpit. And let's face it, I mean, there's some pilots that do that now, right? I was talking to a pilot the other day, and he talked about going on a flight with, I don't know if it was a flight safety instructor or if it was like, as an examiner of some kind. And the pilot I was speaking to, he actually flew the airplane up to cruise altitude, and the instructor looked at him and was like, wow, you didn't use your autopilot. Like every pilot that I get in here with, standard procedure to use the autopilot, but you actually flew the airplane, and I mean, and that's evidence that supports the point that the cockpit's becoming more automated. Humans are becoming more of a monitoring system. And my mentor used to say all the time, if it's one thing that a human's not good at, it's sitting down and monitoring. So there's some concerns there if we don't keep the human being involved in the cockpit when we really do need them to get involved because of some type of, automated system failure. How sharp are they going to be? Are they even going to be able to catch it? I mean, what are they supposed to do? We know what they're supposed to do. Drink coffee, live the dream, look out the window, look at everything there is to be seen, and look at those numbers. Look at those indicators. So we also understand that there's a problem with compensation, right? That's my opinion. I think that there's a problem with compensation. I'm sure other pilots would agree with me, being that I've kind of picked this up from listening to a lot of other pilots. Is the pilots pay how much ever to get their private pilot. I believe to get your private pilot, it's about $8,000. If you just go to a flight school in your local area. I think you could easily get north of that, and I think that's also based on the numbers of it taking you about 40 to 45 hours of training private pilot. We know the bare minimum is 40 hours to go sit for your private pilot exam and to take your check ride. But, some people take, a little more time than that 40. They want to make sure that they have it down. And that's probably a good thing, right? I mean, we just don't want to get the bare minimum and hop out there. That's a one-way ticket to hurt yourself. We want to make sure we feel confident and prove ourselves capable of managing not only this big piece of equipment, but all the small systems and equipment inside of it. Keep the human being involved. I mean, we talk about task saturated. I should have turned that off. My bad. So these pilots pay all this money to become qualified, and then they get their job, after investing, maybe 25, 30 grand in becoming a private pilot, multi-engine rating, instrument rating, commercial rating. Maybe they're 20 or 30 grand in, out of pocket, and then they go maybe 45 grand in, and then they go get their first job, and their first job is like, oh, you'll get paid, $15 an hour based on the tech or the engine or the equipment operating time. And so you may spend, an 8-hour shift, but you only fly for 2 hours and you only get paid for 2 hours. There's all these little odd ways that, companies call themselves compensating the pilot, and the pilot does it right because the pilot wants a flight time. The pilot wants to sharpen their craft. They want to hone their craft. They have their eye on their prize. They're making the sacrifice and the commitment in order to succeed. But that shouldn't be necessary. They should get compensated. They're working, right? They should get compensated properly for being qualified to do the job and doing the job. And I'm not so sure that, and again, this is my personal opinion, I'm not so sure that them flying the equipment should also be compensation for them. Yeah, they once had to pay for this equipment to operate so that they could train in it. But now they're training, they're qualified, they're operating the equipment for you so the company can make money, and pilots should be compensated properly. That's my personal opinion. So that was just on the pilot shortage, and we're going to make this part of our culture and getting to the bottom of this. Is there really a pilot shortage? What are companies doing to aid the industry in creating more qualified pilots? I'm going to do my research on this, and I'm going to take you guys with us. All right, so aircraft of the podcast, right? I wonder if I can call this the podcraft. You get it? Because it's the aircraft of the pod, and this is podcast, and then it's an aircraft, and you put podcast and aircraft together, you get podcraft. I could be reaching there a little bit, aren't I? I don't know, man. I'm just trying to create this podcast culture. Anyway, so the G500. The G500 is the aircraft of this podcast, aka Podcraft. The G500 is a Gulfstream aircraft. So Gulfstream is the manufacturer. G500 is the model. The range on this aircraft is 5,200 nautical miles. So you're going a pretty good distance. 19 passengers. Depending on configuration, right? You can have a lot of different configurations, couches, beds. You can really have it set up for kind of like a board room type meeting. It has auto throttles, auto braking, autopilot, and the pilots have 10 pretty touch screens. Everything's You just touch the screen and the airplane takes off, and they just sit back, they enjoy their coffee, they kick up their feet, they read the latest magazine, a flying magazine, and then they, I'm just kidding. We have no clue. We have no clue how much, again, sacrifice and commitment it takes for those pilots to be able to perform in the cockpit. So let's just go ahead and dig in Manifesto. So we've already covered chapter 1 and chapter 2. Excuse me for bumping that. And we're on chapter 3. All right. Do piston engine TBOs make sense? And TBO is time before overhaul. Again, this is out of the book Manifesto by Mike Busch at AMPIA, Revolutionary Approach to General Aviation Maintenance. This is a really good book. I'm way ahead of what chapter I'm actually reviewing, and I'm going to try to knock these out because this is kind of starting to drag on a little bit. And I want to introduce some other topics on managing aircraft and some things going on there. So, do piston engine TBOs make sense? Despite an overwhelming body of scientific research demonstrating that time-based preventative maintenance is counterproductive, worthless, unnecessary, wasteful, and incredibly costly, we're still doing it. Why? Right? So that's kind of the premise of this chapter. And I'll read the first paragraph. Today, there's only one segment of aviation that has not adopted the enlightened RCM approach to maintenance and still does scheduled preventative maintenance the dumb, old-fashioned way. Sadly, that segment is owner-flown general aviation aircraft, particularly piston-powered general aviation aircraft. We also call those recips. We call piston-powered general aviation aircraft recips. At the bottom of the aviation food chain where a lot of us hang out, even now in the 21st century, maintenance of piston aircraft remains largely time-based rather than condition-based. All right, you guys, so we're talking about time-based versus condition-based. And what is RCM? Remember, RCM is reliability-centered maintenance. So we're talking about replacing things on condition when they fail, when they're starting to show signs of deteriorating. And one of the main reasons why, Mr. Mike Busch is a fan of this is because he kind of spoke about the fact that there's redundancy in these systems in aircraft. There's usually two systems, or there's components that can also do the job. Also, the pilots, they train for these component failures. So it's not an emergency. This is normal stuff, right? So why replace this when there is a backup and a pilot is trained for not only the failure of both these components, but one. And when one fails, the system still operates as it should until it gets to its home, and then we can replace it. But why replace it ahead of time based on this imaginary number that whoever said, hey, every 500 hours we're going to do this, and we're just paying money. We're just paying money on these parts that aren't even bad. We're buying new parts to replace this part that's been on my aircraft operating perfectly fine. Yeah, why am I doing this again? Where does this number come from? And we're going to talk about where that number comes from, or the lack of explanation of where that number comes from. I'll let you decide. I'll just go ahead and read the next chapter. Most owners of piston general aviation aircraft dutifully overhaul their engines at TBO, time before overhaul. So they overhaul their engines at this specified time, like they're supposed to, like they're told, even though they're not bound to it by law. They overhaul their propellers every 5 to 7 years and replace their alternators and vacuum pumps every 500 hours, just as Continental, Lycoming, Hartzell, Macaulay, HET, and Parker Aerospace advise. All right, you guys, so those were all different manufacturers of engines and propellers. Many Bonanza and Baron owners have their wing bolts pulled every 5 years. And most Cirrus owners have their batteries replaced every 2 years for no good reason other than that it's in the manufacturer's maintenance manual. How do we know that there's no good reason? Because he's saying they're operating perfectly fine. Mostly, I think because of fear of litigation, manufacturers are afraid to change anything for fear of being sued. because if they change anything, it could be construed to mean what they were doing before were doing before was wrong. Shops and mechanics are afraid to deviate from what the manufacturer recommends for fear of being sued because they deviated from manufacturer's guidance. So that's the problem. That's the problem. And then to begin to talk about solutions, he says, it's going to have to be the aircraft owners. The aircraft owners are the one that are going to have to lead the way. They need to direct their shops and mechanics to maintain their aircraft that way, or take their maintenance business to someone who will. This means the owners need to have both knowledge and courage, right? And so general aviation aircraft owners have to familiarize themselves with the reliability centered maintenance concept versus the preventative maintenance concept of replacing things based on these times. Okay, so talking about solutions, and the aircraft owners have to familiarize themselves with reliability centered maintenance versus the preventative maintenance techniques that have been practiced that are actually keeping general aviation in a antiquated time compared to other sectors of aviation. And he also, there's a big heading here. It says, when is a piston aircraft engine most likely to hurt you? And it goes on to say, 50 years ago, RCM researchers proved conclusively that overhauling turbine engines at a fixed TBO is counterproductive, and that engines overhaul should be done strictly on condition. But how can we be sure that this also applies to piston aircraft engines? I'm going to continue reading. In the perfect world, Continental and Lycoming would study this issue and publish their findings, but their attorneys won't let that happen. Continental and Lycoming have consistently refused to release any data on engine failure history of their engines. Likewise, they have consistently refused to explain how they arrive at the TBOs they publish. For years, one aggressive plaintiff lawyer after another has tried to compel Continental and Lycoming to answer these questions in court. All have failed miserably. All right, and so that we kind of hit on that in the beginning, is where does this number come from? And that's what everybody wants to know, is where does this number come from? What research do you guys have? What research have you guys done? And by the way, can we see said research to figure out why this number exists, why we should pay the money to overhaul our engines at this number? And by the way, can we see that information? Because we want to make the safest decisions for us. We want to make the best decisions for us. We want to make the smartest decisions for us based on the data. And we don't want to be told what to do. We want to see the data and we want to make the decision. We want to be in control. And Part 91 aircraft owners, you are in control. You are in control. You're the only one in control. Or more so, you have control more so than other operators, right? Or at least that's the argument here. Now, Mr. Mike Busch writes of a brilliant mechanical engineer named Nathan T. Ulrich, PhD of Lee, New Hampshire. He was a U.S. Coast Guard auxiliary pilot who was unhappy that the USCGA policy forbade him from flying volunteer search and rescue missions in his Bonanza engine because it was past TBO. So he analyzed 5 years worth of NTSB accident data for a 5-year period. He analyzed the data. All engines examining. Let's back up. So Dr. Ulrich analyzed 5 years worth of NTSB accident data from 2001 to 2005, examining all accidents involving small piston-powered airplanes under 12.5 gross weight for which the NTSB identified engine failure as a probable cause or contributing factor. And he eliminated those involving air race and agricultural application of aircraft, right? Because that's kind of out of the normal operating envelope of the aircraft. Then he analyzed the relationship between the frequency of engine failure accidents and the number of hours on each engine since it was last built, rebuilt, or overhauled. He did a similar analysis based on the calendar age of the engine. The histograms on the facing page summarized his results. Now I'll tell you, and he even hits right here, these histograms look very familiar. They look just like, or awfully a lot like, the data that C.H. Waddington and his crew produced. And so, when is a engine more likely to fail? In the first 500 hours since overhaul. Not in the first 500 hours after recommended TBO. In the first 500 hours. Okay. When is a engine in age more likely to fail? In the first 4 years. Not at year 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. In the first 4 years. So we're talking about a term. I didn't even know this was like a universal standard term, maintenance term. I thought this was something that my mentor had made up. But it's called infant mortality. And engine failure accidents during the first few years and first few hundred hours after an engine is built, rebuilt, or overhauled. That would be a case of infant mortality. And so catastrophic engine failure is more likely when the engine is young, not when it's old. The next most likely time for you to fall out of the sky, I don't like that term, is shortly after an invasive engine maintenance in the field, particularly cylinder replacement. Big surprise, right? Why overhaul at TBO? Mr. Mike Busch argues, if your engine reaches TBO and still gives every indication of being healthy, good performance, not making metal, decent oil analysis, and boroscope's results are good, overhauling it will clearly degrade safety, not enhance it. That's simply because it will convert your low-risk old engine into a high-risk young engine. I quote, "I don't know about you, but that certainly strikes me as a dumb thing to do." Based on the data, I would agree. Based on the data, especially with them withholding that information, that data as to how they came up with that number. Well, it just leaves a lot of things to be considered. The biggest life-limiting factor is exposure to corrosive environments during periods of disuse. I once told a gentleman that, he doesn't fly his aircraft at all. I think he put 1 hour on it in the last year. And I said, man, letting it sit there is what's going to make it break. You got to fly your aircraft. You got to operate these systems. You have to exercise these systems. It's absolutely, it's critical. It's critical. The next biggest is operator abuse, particularly cold starts and improper power plant management. None of these factors are reflected in the manufacturer's published TBO. Now, this is an interesting discussion point, and I'm going to read this verbatim. Does it make any sense at all that the engine on an aircraft tied down outdoors in Tampa would have the same TBO as one hangared in Tucson? Or that one flies 400 hours a year would have the same TBO as one that flies 40 hours a year? Or that one that flies mostly long-distance cross-country missions would have the same TBO as one used particularly for flight training? Of course not. The whole notion of a one-size-fits-all TBO is inherently nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. Interesting enough, he goes on to talk about the fact that we don't have research on engines. So the counter argument goes something like this. Since we have so little data about the reliability of past TBO engines, how can we be sure that it's safe to operate them beyond TBO? And that brings up something that they talk about as Reznikov conundrum, which states simply that in order to collect failure data, we have to allow the equipment to fail. So I guess it would behoove everyone if Continental or Lycoming, preferably, but someone took a bunch of engines and ran them past 2,000 hours or recommended TBO to see and collect the data on how do these engines perform after TBO. I think we're going to come to a conclusion here, and I'll quote, "The traditional concept of fixed interval TBOs is counterproductive and discredited by scientific research. Piston aircraft engines are most likely to fail when they're young, not when they're old. Old engines should be allowed to remain in service as long as they're healthy and should be overhauled or replaced only when they get sick enough to justify accepting the infant mortality risk of a young engine." Now, when he says old engines should be allowed to remain in service, Part 91 aircraft owners they don't have to overhaul. The TBO is a recommended overhaul number. But I think the problem comes in place when you want to do certain things, like Dr. Yorich wanted to do search and rescue missions and his insurance wouldn't allow it. And he's like, why? That's stupid. My engine's healthy. It's running good. Who cares about this recommended number? It's running good. Let me go do the search and rescue mission. How's my insurance company going to tell me what I can do with the aircraft? Well, we're seeing that as a whole these days, right? Litigation running the world. And so that was chapter 3 of Manifesto, and we're going to dig into chapter 4 here shortly. So let's talk about brand updates. You guys go check out the YouTube videos. I'm starting to share more on YouTube, just, aviation maintenance perspectives on a lot of different things, how-to videos, what it takes to become for those who aspire to be. You can also follow us on all the major platforms, right? So Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and until next time, I want you guys to continue to pursue excellence.